BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. And hello and welcome to this special presentation of Black Box Online Radio. My name is Ned DeHaan and I am your host. In this episode, I will be responding to parts 3 and 4 of a Netflix docu-series called American Conspiracy: The Octopus Murders. And on the Tuesday show, I released a response to parts 1 and 2. And if you haven't heard that yet, that's fine. You can keep listening. I always want these multi-part discussions to be made available to everyone who happens to click on them, but I hope you'll check out the first part in the future if you haven't heard it yet. And if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And to get right into things, if you did not get the chance to listen to part 1, I talked a lot about the suspicious death of Danny Casolaro from the early 1990s in the city of Martinsburg, West Virginia, which is actually rather close to where I grew up, and I hope something is very clear. I was a newcomer to the story, like many people who have learned about this, but the thing that I hope was clear was, if I had to make a determination, I believe that he was murdered, and the official narrative is that he committed suicide. And part 3 of the Octopus Murders on Netflix talked about some different stories, but part 4 really came back to the death of Danny Casolaro. They're doing press conferences, and they're doing explorations in law enforcement, and the ultimate conclusion was that he committed suicide. And, I mean, if you want to check out that episode, I think that he was murdered. If I had to absolutely make a decision right now, that's what I would say, but there is evidence that can go in either direction. And it becomes rather difficult for us when we're just watching a Netflix docuseries and they're talking about some type of twisted conspiracy that is involving the deaths of all these other people, and you want to know, well, are these guys actually telling the truth, or is all of the information in this documentary accurate? And even in the series, The Octopus Murders on Netflix, they have one source who is just providing people with information, and then they investigate it, and it turns out that it's just completely false. They're following the leads of some of these conspiracy theories, and their investigation just hits a dead end. But I want to pick up with something that is from part 3 of American Conspiracy: The Octopus Murders, and that relates to how there is a conspiracy, that there's an interconnection of U.S. elites that are infiltrating foreign governments and international circuits, and even organized crime syndicates. And what they're trying to say is that these people, a group of 12 people actually, is not part of the organized crime factions themselves, but they have control and the ability to manipulate them or to use them to their advantage. And some of the people in this group of 12 would be E. Howard Hunt, Wild Bill Casey. I should have just called him William Casey. I've always thought of him as Wild Bill Casey. That's how I first learned about him. And even George H.W. Bush. George Bush I was the first president and only president to be the former CIA director to go on and obtain the presidency. And they were saying that a group of 12 people just has an enormous amount of established connections using all types of illegal measures to manipulate the power process around the world. And a writer named Danny Casolaro was on the verge of breaking the story, and then all of a sudden he's found dead in a hotel room in Martinsburg, West Virginia. To help us out, I'm going to jump over to an article from People magazine that says, "The Octopus Conspiracy was the theory that Casolaro was investigating the suggested Inslaw case, the Iran-Contra arms deal, the October surprise and the closure of the BCCI, and other global scandals, including Watergate and the Bay of Pigs invasion, and stating that they were all connected and orchestrated by a ring of rogue intelligence officers. Casolaro planned to uncover this supposed conspiracy and call it the Octopus." And the reason why is because it's like how an octopus would have its tentacles in a bunch of different directions. This conspiracy had its tentacles in a bunch of different directions. And I've talked about some of the terminology before. This would definitely fall into the category of a super conspiracy, where the majority of international and worldly events are all linked and manipulated by a small group of people. And some people like to use the term oligarchy, but in a super conspiracy, you don't even necessarily have to be a conventional oligarch. It's just having the ability and means to do so. But in part 3 of the Netflix docuseries, they began to explore a murder that I have not discussed yet, and that is the death of Paul Morasca, and he was a partner of an individual named Michael Riconosciuto. And I would like to go over to an article from the Cinemaholic that is also going to provide us with some information about the suspicious death of Paul Morasca. And one more time from the Cinemaholic, this is written by Naman Shrithra, just citing the source. When Danny Casolaro was found dead under mysterious circumstances, the case opened a can of worms that had to do with the investigative journalist working on a political conspiracy that was known as the Octopus murders, and this is covered in a Netflix docu-series. The intricate details of this case also contain interviews and family members and friends of the victims who lost their lives at the expense of the conspiracy. Alleged, I'll just say that. And officials involved in the entire case. The episode also delves deeper into the gruesome murder of Paul Morasca, who became one of the casualties linked to the Cabazon Reservation in the southwestern part of the United States. Paul Morasca was found hogtied and dead in his San Francisco apartment. And when I said southwestern, they're talking about the Cabazon Reservation that is in Southern California, and of course, he is found dead in Northern California. Paul Morasca was found hog-tied and dead in his San Francisco apartment. Known for his financing skills, Paul Morasca made the most of it and became a money launderer. Since his teenage years, he had been friends with Michael Riconosciuto, a scientist with a sharp mind who turned into his roommate, best friend, and business partner. On the professional front, he worked with Michael and was a money trader of Cabazon with access to several offshore bank accounts amounting to more than $1 billion per Michael's claims. And as it says, per his claims, I mean, you really got to wonder who's telling the truth, who is not, who is just mistaken. While everything was seemingly going smoothly in life, Paul was not aware of the fact that he had a target on his back. On January 13th of 1982, 6 months after the tragic demise of Fred Alvarez, his childhood friend Michael, whose mind was ruined by drugs, at Paul's San Francisco apartment on Kearny Street near Telegraph Hill, he was found with something that shook him to the core. This is Michael they're talking about, his beloved friend Paul was killed with the help of a murder technique popular amongst the Japanese mafia that makes the victims struggle before they slowly asphyxiate themselves to death. And to be clear, again, that's Paul Morasca, who is found dead in this hog-tied type of manner, and they really kind of just glossed over this and glazed over it with the Netflix docu-series, but there is an illustration that they did provide talking about how he is hog-tied, but the restraints also went around his neck. And some people, when these type of events happen, always people use the explanation, oh, it's a sex act gone wrong, oh, it was some type of suicide that was unlikely, but he was still able to pull it off. Or maybe he even had a partner that was doing this consensually and it wasn't designed to commit homicide. It was just an accident and that person fled the scene. Those types of explanations are very easy to provide with these situations. Upon entering the condominium, Michael saw that Paul had his wrist tied behind his back, while a wire was tied from his neck to his ankles. When he failed to keep his legs bent, the wire strangled him slowly. The strangulation caused this merciless technique to become the cause of Paul's gruesome demise. Instead of informing the police then and there, Michael got back into his car and made the 500-mile trip to the Cabazon Indian Reservation located outside of Palm Springs, California. As soon as he reached his destination, the scientist told Dr. John Philip Nichols that he had found Paul murdered in his apartment in San Francisco. Soon the police launched an investigation into the case and started looking for possible suspects and evidence from the crime scene. Paul's killer has never been positively identified, Paul being the money launderer who handled the finances of the Cabazon and Nichols operation. Had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into Nichols' operation, and he is also referred to as Dr. John. You'll see him there. And they didn't talk too much about his doctoral work in the docuseries, The Octopus Murders, but they did show one of his degrees on the screen, and it just said that his doctorate was actually in religious studies as opposed to, anything related to finances or science, the subjects that we've been previously discussing. And he also worked among the Cabazon Arms confidants while having access to codes for multiple offshore bank accounts. 1 month or so before the murder of Paul, The murder of Paul, 1 month or so before the murder of Paul, Nichols owned the Cabazon India Casino, and it went bankrupt, and he filed for bankruptcy in December of 1981. With so much loss, Nichols began to look for avenues to recover his lost money. It was alleged that Paul had been asking for money, and when he did not get what he demanded, he began exposing CIA activities, especially the truth about Wackenhut, a corporation, and a meeting was held at Vanessi's restaurant in San Francisco where many key individuals were in attendance, including Michael's father, Marshall Riconosciuto, John Philip Nichols, Philip Arthur Thompson, and they supposedly devised a plan to murder Paul. And if you were to watch the Netflix docuseries The Octopus Murders, they're really going to zone in on how this person named Philip Arthur Thompson should be the prime suspect in the murder of Paul Morasca. Again, the killer has never been identified. This is all alleged. And they presented that in a very simple theory. But if you go back to part 1 of this discussion, you'll see I was discussing the murder of Fred Alvarez and 2 of his friends. And what they're trying to say in the Octopus Murders documentary is that certain people knew too much. Certain people had knowledge. Certain people also felt cheated, like Paul Morasca, and they were murdered to be silenced, whereas somebody like Danny Casolaro was someone who was investigating this and wanted to break the story. And the theory is, I repeat, theory is that he was murdered to be silenced for a different reason. Now, some of you may remember the old Stones Unturned podcast that was hosted by Thomas Henry Horan, and he always told us to remember 3 names: Arthur Michael Pascal, Ronald Hadley Stark, and Philip Arthur Thompson. And here's where we see and hear Philip Arthur Thompson coming into the play as a possible murderer, working on behalf of the global elites, or at the very least, a very small group of elites. As I said, there are ultimately 12 people who are the most important individuals, including former President H.W., but there was actually an opportunity in the docuseries The Octopus Murders to hear the voice of Philip Arthur Thompson, and he sounded nothing like how I imagined him. I thought that he would sound like a big tough guy, but he was more just like, "Oh no, I know nothing about that." Sometimes people can fool you. But let's go back to the Cinemaholics article. When the investigation for Paul's murder began, his roommate and best friend Michael Riconosciuto was one of the initial suspects on the police list. But as the authorities dug deeper, they found out about a man named Jason Smith, a CIA hitman whose real name was Philip Arthur Thompson. As I said, CIA hitman committing murders on behalf of the global elites. Paul's then-girlfriend claimed that at the time he was frightened for his life, and he was particularly afraid of the hitman, who had a lengthy arrest record and a long history of violent crimes to his name, including kidnapping, rape, murder, escape attempted, robbery, and even just robbery. After all, despite these charges, he had hardly served any time behind bars. And this is something else that was discussed in the Octopus Murders, meaning that if somebody is useful to not only the global elites, I believe they actually said if somebody is useful to the government, they can get a pass. If somebody is useful to the CIA, they can get a pass. And if somebody is useful just to any high-ranking and powerful individual, they can get a pass. They can do things like commit murder and get away with it. That is more or less the thesis statement of the Octopus Murders, and the reason why it's called the Octopus Murders plural as opposed to only investigating the suspicious death of Danny Casolaro is that they're looking at how there are these people who have committed, I shouldn't even use the word committed, they're people who are doing things that are not in line with the agenda of certain people, and they get taken out. They end up dead under very suspicious circumstances. And I am putting the story of Paul Morasca in a very similar category, as I said, with Danny Casolaro. If I had to make a determination right now, yes, I do think that he was murdered. But officially, his death is, well, no one has been convicted for the murder. Let's just leave it at that. Now, this is not a political channel. I'm not a political person. I don't follow any of the political stuff anymore. And I'm going to share something, though, that I heard from the comedian Bill Burr, and I want you guys to accept it as just that. This is just something I heard on YouTube one day, and I don't mean to affect your political thinking in any way, but he said that the reason why we got Donald Trump in power was because of 8 years of Obama. The reason why we got Obama was because of 8 years of W. The reason why we got W was because of 8 years of Clinton. And the reason why we had Clinton was because of 12 years of Reagan-Bush. That's from the comedian Bill Burr on his podcast. 12 years of Reagan-Bush. And the Reagan-Bush era was just a hotbed of CIA activity, not only because George H.W. Bush went on to be president, but he was Reagan's vice president, former director of the CIA. And the CIA operative John Stockwell went public and wrote a book called In Search of Enemies, and he was ultimately sued by the CIA for revealing their secrets. And the Reagan era was all about the biggest peacetime buildup in the history of the world. Buildup of military weapons and technology and all sorts of financially driven for-profit warmongering, but not in the United States. Not in the United States. I mean, a lot of this is related to the interactions of smaller groups around the world. And I mean, the thing that John Stockwell always likes to talk about is Frontline did a show and they won an Emmy for an episode called Guns, Drugs, and the CIA, looking at how the CIA is manipulating the drug trade, looking at just how the CIA is unexamined, so it has the ability to manipulate global affairs and manipulate what is happening in the world, let alone situations like Iran-Contra. I mean, talking about Iran in the Middle East, the Contras in Nicaragua and Central America, and so on. And when you just look at other CIA operatives that have gone public talking about how they had the assignment to poison a cafeteria's milk supply in Cuba, and you can find more things like that in the book Deadly Deceit by Ralph McGehee, and it just goes to show that there is this type of frustration with the establishment that really, really zoned in on the 12 years of Reagan-Bush. And again, I'm not trying to put down Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush. I didn't know them personally. These are just ideas that have been shared. And one thing that I do stand by is the American people do become frustrated with the establishment because of things like the Octopus murders, things like this Netflix docuseries American Conspiracy, when they just share it all out there. And a lot of it is still a legend, but we do get to see that these types of conspiracies are not baseless. There are facts in them. And we also have suspicions, and some of the suspicions are unconfirmed, but I definitely believe that a lot of what they're saying is perhaps most likely true. As I said, if I had to make decisions right now, I would say that Danny Casolaro was murdered, Paul Morasca was murdered, and also that there is a lot of truth to this octopus conspiracy, that certain people are manipulating the power system. What is so crazy about that? You don't have to get into the whole Alex Jones thing about how the globalists are trying to kill you. Instead, you can just look at it from the fact that people are manipulating the power system to their advantage, and this group of 12 people figured out a way to do that, or at the very least, they're using certain tactics from the Cold War and the, in the aftermath of World War II to manipulate said power system, and that's how they took advantage of the system. But what do you think about any of this? You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. One more time, this was a direct response to the Netflix docuseries American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders, as well as referencing People Magazine and Cinemaholic. And rest in peace to Paul Morasca, rest in peace to Fred Alvarez and his friends, rest in peace to Danny Casolaro. And that'll be all for me now. And please feel free to visit some of the links in the description box here. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe. And also, I want your comments in the section down below. Tell me everything that you think about the Octopus Murders. And I will see you over on Instagram. Until next time.